Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bailey Mizell, the director of PAC LA. We're here today with our president, Michael Hawley, and Mary Beth Heffernan, who will be presenting an artist talk for us and discussing her renowned PPE Portrait Project and some of her current photographic works. As usual, I'd like to give a shout out to our programming advisory group for your ongoing support, making events like today happen, and our membership base that also for their longstanding support of PAC LA. We're happy to be here with you. And again, thank you for joining us. Just a quick run of show. Mary Beth will be presenting to us for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then we will all join together again for a Q&A and open conversation moderated by myself and Michael Hawley. We encourage you, please, at any point during the conversation and the presentation to please add your questions to the chat and Q&A, and we will answer them as they come. Thank you to the guests that have asked questions and given comments in advance at registration. We have your questions saved, and we'll get to those as soon as we start that portion. And then I just want to quickly introduce Mary Beth. Mary Beth Heffernan is a Los Angeles-based artist whose work explores the interplay of corporeality and images. She is a professor of sculpture, photography, and interdisciplinary art at Occidental College. Heffernan earned her BFA at Boston University in 1987, graduating Magna Cum Laude, and awarded the Kahn Career Entry Award. She earned her MFA in the Photography program at the California Institute of the Arts in 1994, and appointed a studio fellow of the Whitney Independent Study Program in 1994 to 95. As usual, I'll add a link to her full biography in the chat. And then I want to hop over now to Michael Hawley for a quick introduction, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, so welcome, Mary Beth. Thanks, Bailey. I'm very happy everyone's here. This is a program that I really have been wanting to do for a long time. Mary Beth is a longtime supporter of PAC and was the recipient of a PAC grant with the Huntington several years ago to work on a project there, which was super interesting that she may touch on in this talk. This work intrigued me from the very beginning. You know, Mary Beth's work in general is just replete with empathy, is what I would say. And it's like empathy is this gift and not everybody has it, and Mary Beth has it in spades. And so I think that we're going to be in for a very interesting talk today. And I'm so glad you agreed to come and talk to us today, Mary Beth. So welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Michael and Bailey, for that incredibly generous introduction. And also thank you to PAC LA, who have been amazingly supportive of me over the years. I was a grateful recipient of a research grant to work in the collections at the Huntington and to work with Jenny Watts. And it was an amazing opportunity for me. So, and I'm going to start off my talk today with the image that I produced at the Huntington. So I thought Michael and Bailey asked me to put the work, the PPE Portrait Project, in the text of some other series that I've done over the years and some work that I'm working on right now. And hopefully we can generate some conversation around some of the commonalities of the work between the social practice and the more studio-based work and everything in between. Should I start screen sharing now,
Yes.
Bailey?
Yes, and we will be here for you if you have any questions. We can let you know if you sound great. We'll be off screen and come back.
Okay, great. Let's just get this going on. Okay, so I use a broad range of media in different modes of address, from object and studio-based practices to social practice projects where the image is a catalyst for human connection. My work is united by abiding questions about physicality, and in particular, corporeality and representation, and asking, like in this work that I did at the Huntington, whose bodies are made available for others' use? How are bodies transcribed into photographs, scans, graphs, or algorithms? How do pictures literally and figuratively change our bodies and our relationship to others? How and when does language take on physical force? And what are the gaps and failures of language to translate the complexities of the physical world and the complexities of daily labor. Also, how does representation grapple, or how do we grapple with representation and how we represent love and physicality? And the commingling of body and spirit, especially after death. And how does the dissolution of the body mirror the end limits of representation itself? How can images be used to help us reconnect as human beings and activate our healing mechanisms and help us feel whole? As I mentioned, Bailey and Michael asked me to focus on 3 bodies of work: Replete, Blue, Ashes, and the PPE Portrait Project. The Replete series that I did in 1995 continued work that I had started in the early 90s, where I was making skin and I was making small sculptures fabricated from skin and meat that I bought from butcher shops. And in the 3rd series of working in this mode, I was all throughout this time, I was also in conversation with 19th century and early 20th century medical photographs. In particular, you can see here this Stanley Burns archive photograph. I was really interested in the rhetoric of display and how photography shifted from this portrait mode of photographing a subject whose humanity you can grasp because it uses portrait, the rhetoric of portrait photography, and how this shifts as photography and science needed photographs to function as truth, and the rhetoric of visual empiricism was changing to adapt to science's changing needs. And so we shift from the parlor in the photographer's studio to the elimination of backgrounds, to the isolation of parts of the body, to develop a kind of language of pathologization. And so I was going to archives, of course this was before the internet, going to the Mutter Museum and other archives. Even these Stanley Burns photographs hadn't been published yet. And also I was looking not only at these medical archives, but I was also conjuring the art history I had studied as an art student. And so I felt like I was, in making these sculptures, almost like a pathologist of art history, as much as also thinking about medical history. So I'm also conjuring how are bodies displayed throughout art history, and how did that become a kind of repertoire in my mind as an art school student. And so this series, you see this oscillation between the part and a whole, right? It's almost a kind of synecdoche where a part is standing in for a whole, or there's this oscillation between the fragment and a whole body. I also managed to see this incredible archive of engravings at some of Harvard's rare book medical libraries, and in particular William Hunter's The Human Gravid Uterus. That was about 20 by 24 inches, and that's in its horrible repletion. It was incredibly detailed, but also, to a grotesque degree. And so I was interested in I'm going to jump ahead a second, in mirroring that in these photographs that were also 20 by 24 inches. I was also interested in teratomas, in these kind of growths, mostly benign tumors, where perfectly formed, where germ cells kind of reactivate and form these tumors where there are perfectly formed parts like hair and teeth and sclera, but they're combined in a completely heterotopic way. And so I was interested in that perfection and wrongness that exists simultaneously in those kind of tumors. And so I did this whole series that drew on those characteristics. And I felt like I was kind of plumbing my own knowledge about, of course, this archive that I had inherited, and in a sense pathologizing it as I was processing what this art historical inheritance meant. Skipping ahead to the Blue series, so clearly there's an interest in the intermingling of photography and sculpture. This series, the Blue series, it began actually with a sculpture that you see on the left. And it also came from overhearing a conversation or hearing a similar webinar where the writer Howard Rodman was interviewing Antonia Fraser, and she had just come out with the book. It was late 2010, and she had just come out with the book about her longtime husband, Harold Pinter, and it was called Must You Go? And so they were having a conversation. I don't know if she knew that Howard Rodman was also a recent widower. And he asked her about what happens when this long physical life together is split apart. Is there still a physical element? Does that person haunt you or arouse you, or is it coexistent? Is it still companionable? Is it violent and disturbing? And she didn't really answer. And so I tried to answer that with this series. I was fortunate in that I had known about cyanotypes, and the director at the Idlewild Park Center, Mallory Kremen, also happened to be an artist who used cyanotype and had the chemicals on hand. And she said, I'll get some ready and some fabric. So we chopped down the sculpture, hauled it out in the middle of the winter in Idlewild. There was snow on the ground, and we found a patch of sun right before the sun was going down behind the mountain, and exposed this piece you see on the right in the parking lot there. And it was looking at this sculpture and realizing that I found it dissatisfying, but I was obsessed with its shadow. And I realized that the work was in the shadow, in the absence of the piece. And so that's when we decided, when I decided to attempt a photogram, and in particular cyanotype. And that gave rise to this series that I did the following summer in earnest. You can see a process shot of this. And so this series was imagining that intermingling of not just the living and the dead, but the part of the living that becomes dead, or the part of the dead that keeps on living. You can, of course, see the influence of early X-rays. I love the title of, this was one of the first books illustrating X-ray technology, the photography of the invisible. What could be more perfect than that? And then you can also see the influence of, say, photographs that like Albert Lond did for Jean-Martin Charcot at La Salpêtrière in Paris, the photographs of the so-called hysterics in the 1880s. Of course, a concept that would get debunked, but whose imagery continues to haunt and animate a lot of, I would say, feminist art production in the present, including mine. And you can see in the kind of convulsive quality of these works, that language at play here. And this series pretty directly led into another series called Ashes, that I did in collaboration with my friend and colleague and art historian, Amy Lyford. She and I had both lost our mothers. Our mothers both died within 6 months of each other. And the two of us had a really rich conversation about it, or an ongoing set of conversations. And my mother in the Catholic tradition had been embalmed and buried, and her mother was cremated. And so Amy and I did a series where I knew that I needed to use photograms as in the Blue series, but that I wanted more precision. And I also wanted it to be black and white, and reference a kind of proto-digital quality to this primitive form of photography, even though it's like gelatin silver paper. There was something about the ashes. I was looking at what are the end limits of when a body is still considered a body. And the answer was that cremains are it. That that is the body at the last modicum of recognizability, before it becomes dust or just other. And so in conversation with Amy and about her mother's decision to be cremated, we devised a performance where Amy would, this is a photograph of the bag on the right of Jean Thomas Lyford's cremains, and a little bit of her cremains on the left. And so we devised these performances where Amy would lay on the photo paper and allow me to shower her with her mother's cremains. And after I was done, I would brush her off and help her off the paper. And then I would expose what was left behind. So the silhouette. So I was essentially using her body as a kind of stencil to make these photograms. So I exposed the paper, and then I made a whole custom darkroom that with custom enormous troughs, so I could process the paper, and an 8-foot-long sink to wash it, that kind of thing. So even making the photographs was a very physical, kind of performative action. But that's what went into this series. And to me, it really embodies the conundrum. The photographs themselves embody the conundrum of presence and loss, that the outline is Jean Lyford's body, or what remains of Jean Lyford's body. And the absence is her daughter's body that's still living. And the very terms of the photogram, right, that a presence, the white part is recorded as an absence, kind of doubly encodes this paradox of the presence of the late mother's body in the absence of the living daughter's body, So I thought, for me, there was a tremendous, I guess, like the way that my interest in the very nature of picturing itself paralleled the kind of end limits of the body as such. And to me, that's kind of almost like the mystery, the sacred mystery of photography. It's allotropic quality of being both icon and index, and that these are pictures involving touch and not, that they're not reproducible. So there's a kind of intimacy that I wanted in using this technique. And obviously you can also see the echoes of the earlier references that I mentioned with blue. And then I did a whole series that were just hands, because again, in my interest of parts standing in for the whole, they allowed me to do that in a way that they're almost more powerful than picturing the head. And that's so interesting because this next series, the PPE Portrait Project, obviously it privileges the face. And I'm not a face essentialist, as we say. I deeply understand the problematics of the history of physiognomy and of the origins of eugenics, based in an attempt to quantify and pathologize the appearance of the face. But I also understand that it is an incredibly powerful site on the body that does stand in as a kind of signature of the self. And we all know now what it means to feel when that's withdrawn. And I was first, and we were all, whether or not we were paying attention, in 2015, folks in West Africa were faced with care that was faceless care. And I was very mindful of the fact that every bit of reportage that I heard talked about the frightening PPE and how that was frightening people away from getting care for totally understandable reasons. And I wondered if the PPE, or personal protective equipment, could be made less frightening if people were able to see a picture of the person inside. And so I started doing mock-ups. What if this looked like that? This is a picture of Dr. Jerry Brown as a resident. So I started doing, this is an illustration, it's a mock-up of a Médecins Sans Frontières picture of healthcare workers in PPE, but I took another picture from one of their meetings and pasted the faces on the front of the suits. And this is what I was mentally doing at the time. Every time I heard a story talking about how frightening they were, I mentally started photoshopping a portrait onto the front and thought, well, wouldn't one want to be able to see who was inside so that you knew who was caring for you? So I managed to reach out to the doctors who were closest, who were providing direct care, and in particular in Liberia, of course, helped by language and historic connections between the US and Liberia. So I was able to correspond with and send those early beta prototypes to Dr. Jerry Brown. And I exchanged emails with Dr. J. Soka Moses, who at the time was running the Liberia's largest Ebola treatment center called MOD, the military defense. It was a military defense site, Ebola treatment center, and his boss, the chair of Ebola case management, Dr. Moses Massaquoi. And Dr. Massaquoi invited me to bring the project to Liberia in early 2015. And at that point, well, even before that point, months before that point, I had plunged myself into a multi-part set of research. One was on the medical literature on source isolation. And not surprisingly, periods as short as 24 hours a day can have long-term psychological consequences. So I looked at the literature around what happens to people who are isolated and sick, whose illness threatens their caregivers, whose caregivers have to cover up in PPE. And there's an incredibly intense, patients feel guilty about potentially infecting their caregivers. They feel angry about their condition. They don't like being separated from others. They get anxious, and on and on and on. And it has long-term effects after people get out of that care. I also did a whole bunch of technical research on, could these labels be printed without electricity? Could they be printed without a computer? I wanted to minimize the use of technology to the extent that I could. I also looked at what are the cultural meanings of a picture on the chest area. Were there any funeral traditions or other traditions using photographs that could somehow backfire and not mean what I thought they meant, and so on. And so I intensely threw myself into the research, and that's when I was able to connect with doctors working at other ETUs in Liberia to talk about the workflows and the donning and doffing processes, and also doctors like J. Soka Moses, who were working on the ground and said, this is brilliant. We only have supportive care. Psychosocial measures are huge, and this will make patients more receptive to our care. So he just said, hurry up and get over here because we need it now. So I, 1 month after Dr. Moses Massaquoi's invitation, I was in Liberia. I had garnered informed consent for human subjects here in the US. It enabled me to get a grant from the Arnold P. Gold Foundation and Occidental College. And within 1 day, I had the project up and running at the Liberian Health Department's own run Ebola treatment center called Elwa 2. And here is Helen Saki with her labels and her informed consent form. And I was given advice about how to print the photos, which ones people liked, how they wanted their photo color corrected, etc. I trained others like Ben Smith to take over and photograph others, like we have a physician assistant here on the right. Here's the donning room with Kaifuba Kamara and another hygienist preparing to enter the hot zone. And here's Eddie Johnson, a hygienist in the decontamination process, being sprayed down with a bleach solution. The patients, according to the healthcare workers who spoke directly with the patients, they loved being able to identify who was taking care of them. And because as Princess, another healthcare worker, Princess Adokai, mentioned that a lot of patients couldn't read the names that were written on their aprons. And she said, so the photographs really had a powerful impact with enabling them to differentiate the healthcare workers and get a sense that their fellow Liberians were caring for them, in some case, people that they already knew from town. And so fast forward 6 years, Katie Brown Johnson, a research scientist at Stanford, reached out to me in April of 2020 and said, we need PPE portraits up here right now. And she was an incredible dynamo. I sent her a quickly put together set of guidelines, and she got the project up and running at the Stanford Express Care clinics in a weekend. And this is Anna, a nurse in the Stanford Express Care clinics, and Winnie Traub, palliative care physician in Stanford Health. And here's a collective that we formed with Katie, who's pictured in the center, Paige Parsons, who was an area human-centered design specialist, and other young researchers who worked for Katie Brown Johnson in the Presence 5 program at Stanford. So we had weekly meetings in rolling out the project and helping other hospitals across the country adopt the project. Among those who adopted it, quickly, very soon after Stanford, was UMass Palliative Medicine. There's Dr. Isabel Castro, others from Shauna Stedman and Nancy McCool from UMass Memorial Medical Center. Michaela, a nurse practitioner. Santi Kumar and Christine Trubshaw here at USC Keck were also early practitioners. And then folks in Canada reached out and spread to music therapy. Here's Anna Chico again. And Paige Parsons assisted a whole group of people adopting it for dementia care in Northern California. Alex Evans in Northern California, Minako Watabe in Ventura, folks at LA County USC, Mass General, Tucson Medical Center. The head of nuclear medicine who rolled it out there called it a visual laying on of hands, which I thought was so interesting because throughout my practice, I've been interested in this idea of a kind of synesthesia of bringing things from one representational register to another. So I thought that was so interesting that he identified Larry Hanlon, Dr. Larry Hanlon, I characterized it that way. And here's Adamo Donovan, who is the dynamo behind the uptake and spread of PPE portraits across Canada. It's now, there are over 2,500 portraits in use in 21 cities, in 5 provinces, and 27 professions, thanks to his advocacy and chops, organizational chops. He's really been a dynamo in bringing and spreading the practice across Canada. And I also have to thank my students. I taught a class this past fall, and my students across the country and across the world rolled out project sites, including Ali Fukada, who instituted the project at St. Marianne University Medical Hospital COVID unit, one of the units with the largest COVID caseload in all of Japan. And here are some projects from the COVID wing there. Again, Santhi and Christina. Alexis Gordon was another person who reached out to me from LA County USC and the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit. And I'll wrap up with this last photo from LA County. Student of mine and I, Eliza Kirk from Oxy, are doing research with them this summer on their thoughts about the effectiveness of the project. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to your questions.
Mary Beth, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. Very thorough and insightful. We have a few questions here. I want to start with one from Tracy Rosen, who would ask, where did you even know where to begin connecting with medical teams already on site for the Ebola outbreak? And did anyone try to persuade you not to go?
Tracy, that's a really great question. And sometimes in some of my talks, I actually include a photo of an enormous spreadsheet that I created to keep track of all of the people that I contacted. I started reaching out to anybody that I knew that was in medicine, public health, diplomacy. And first of all, with the medical people, I asked, do you think this is a good idea? And everyone thought it was a good idea. And so they would sometimes refer me to somebody else and then somebody else. And it got so that I had contacted hundreds of people and was in contact with, major international aid agencies or groups that were donating massive amounts of PPE to West Africa. And people were interested and fascinated, but they just didn't feel like they were in a position to commit to partnering, or they couldn't envision how they could partner, or they just, it was just too much. Like people were just trying to make the relief effort happen. And it was, I had made a connection with a doctor. I had read a news story about Dr. Stephen Hatch, who was working in, I think, Bong County in northern Liberia. And I just found his email and wrote to him. And he actually wrote to me from Liberia and, in between his care. And he said, this is a fabulous idea. We could definitely use this. And he talked to me about the architecture of the Ebola treatment unit, how it moved from the green zone into the red zone, and what the contamination or decontamination burden would be. Like I had to study I had to analyze every aspect of the donning and doffing procedure to minimally impose in that process. But I almost gave up. Like I had hundreds of names on this sheet, but nothing broke through. And finally, in very early January of 2015, I was introduced to a doctor who had actually been to Liberia and got Ebola and recovered. And I got to meet him in person. And on a piece of paper, he scrawled the name of Dr. Soka Moses, Dr. Moses Massaquoi, and Dr. Brown, and their contact info. And that's when I wrote directly to them. And Dr. Soka Moses wrote back almost immediately. And he said, this is brilliant. This would really help people accept our care. And I will do this. I'll have all my staff do it, but I just need to ask my boss. And then I was like, oh, and Dr. Massaquoi answered right away. And that's when I realized, okay, it's time to make this happen. And so it went from kind of this theoretical thing to something that I had to make happen. So within 1 month, I passed the human subjects review. I submitted a quick turnaround medical grant, which I garnered. And 1 month later, I was in Liberia, and 2 days later had the project up and running. But there were many things that I won't burden you with right now, that any number of things could have easily have made this not happen.
Mary Beth, one of the things that's very fascinating to me is you were talking about, when you were talking about the series with the cremains, being about presence and loss, and looking at the people, you know, clad in their PPE gear, their presence is lost, essentially.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, the through line between your more traditional art practice, actually the cremains, the Sienna type series, the series, the photographs before, and this series, this project, which is more of an anthropological project. I'm interested in the through line between your art and this project, which is, you know, world changing, that in a sort of way that, you know, who do we know in our lives who changed the world? Mary Beth Heffernan.
Oh,
right?
man.
That's it. But
Thank you.
but I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that, if that's something that.
Well, I think in my, if we can just call it my studio-based work, that I think about conditions or the, you know, experiences or phenomenon, like a sense of loss or grieving. And I try to figure out, what does that, how can I translate that into something palpable or visible? So it's an active translation. That's why I often describe it as a kind of synesthesia, that you take something from one register and try to instantiate it in another. And then here, it's almost like inverse. Here, I have this physicality, right? We have these physical conditions, you know, healthcare workers, sick people, you know, we have, you know, we have the mise en scène, if you will. And so the part of it was trying to think about, how do you create the connection that, say, a beholder of artwork feels when they're in front of the artwork. Like, I often refer to that moment as a kind of, especially when you're in a museum, like with a guard nearby, I always feel like it's a conjugal visit. It's like trying to make love in jail, or like you're being surveilled at a really intimate moment. And so in a sense, I was trying to create that same thing, but by using a picture as a catalyst.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's the through line. They were like inverse challenges,
Right.
But similar, I think.
Right.
I don't think of them as, I mean, they are obviously wildly different in the way that they play, where they play out and how they play out. Mm-hmm. But the thing about presence and understanding a human loss and desire for connection is at the heart of it.
Right, right.
at all.
Really, do you think that that's a good transition to this other quote, that Jeremy question?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I
You
was
want to
going.
read that one?
We have a question here from Jeremy Adair. He says, in your pre-main series, the images of the bodies outline like they're falling or otherwise are having some dynamic motion. Was this deliberate or a coincidental consequence of you trying different positions and perhaps getting separation of body parts from the model? The second half of that question is, can one assume that you only had a limited number of positions you could try, considering you were using the ashes of the model's mother and the amount of ashes you could use was finite?
Yeah, try to go back to the first question. Thank you for that. I think one of the first surprises, there were 3 different sessions. So this body of work was done over 3 different sessions. And then over a year later, we went back and did a series of hands. But the first session was very bulky, and actually the Amy Lyford's husband was present to physically help out and also emotionally support her. So we were in a darkened room with just a few red light bulbs. So it was very dark, not like a bright dark room, but it was pretty murky. And I think that's why the first image is very static. She just laid down on the paper, kind of like, I don't want to say like a corpse, but she just laid down with her hands flat by her side. And actually the dynamism of that first piece was in the mistake, which was there was a whole bunch of ash in her hair. And when she got up, it dumped into the silhouette. That's why you see that almost like David Bowie, like,
gesture.
Start, yeah,
Lightning
that
bolt, yeah.
lightning bolt through the head. That was the ash dumping off her head into the silhouette. I actually recollected her mother's ashes in between each exposure. I actually bought a hake brush, a Japanese paste brush, which is sewn together and it has natural bristles. So I brought a dedicated brush that I would carefully sweep up the ashes. Well, first of all, I would take the paper and put them toward the middle so that they went toward the middle. And then I kind of scooted them to the side and tried to get them back in the bag. And then I would take this special brush and again, try to get them into the bag. And then whatever else was on the floor, in which I tried to minimize, I wrapped those up into paper that I then folded and we put into this box with the rest of the cremains so that Amy could burn those if she wanted to, and that someday she could also burn that brush.
Right.
So that brush was never used for anything except for touching her mother's remains. So there was that. So I did recollect them, but of course there was attrition. And Amy and I went through a really interesting process. I gave her, similar to the informed consent forms that I did in Liberia, I created an informed consent form for her. And I listed all of the hazards that I thought, both physical and psychological, that I could anticipate, and the possible benefits. And we both signed that form, and I gave her a copy and I kept a copy. And so we both saw this as part of the artwork, this consent, her giving consent to do these performances. And so to get back to the question, like what her pose looked like, it took a while to realize what the pose would look like in the print. It was a huge surprise. And the depth of and perception of movement was really interesting because it just would look nothing like what was going on with her pose. And it was really hard to hold those poses for a long time. Like Amy's an athlete, and toward the end of the pose, she would be shaking just to hold the pose so long. And so it was a real like durational performance on her part, and somewhat, to of course a lesser extent, a little bit on my part too.
Mhm.
Mine was more like in the processing of the whole prints, which would take, I would get up at 4 a.m. to try to do 1 or 2 before work or something, like they would take an entire day to bring through the chemistry and through the wash, and like a big floor squeegee. And I hope that answers your question. I'm trying to think of the second part. So there was, okay, so in the subsequent sessions, I knew I had to get more efficient because it was really hard on Amy. So I developed things like, instead of trying to process the prints right away, I put them in an enormous light safe that I made out of, those concrete barrels that they pour concrete columns in. Those, I made one of those into a huge light safe. So I would be able to, so I pre-cut the paper, and then I would put the prints or the exposed paper into the barrel and put a light-proof cap on it. And then later I would go back and print them one by one. So I could do more poses with Amy, like in a condensed period of time, to respect her physical and emotional limits.
Mhm.
Thank you for going into that process, Mary Beth. Just one final question that I'd like to pose. Unless there's any other questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. So this is based on your PPE Portrait Project, but also your work all around in the little conversation we've had prior. I just want to know if you can expand on your interest and current research on the device of the self in relativity to isolation and the device of isolation and care. Any future steps you have for that project, but also in that research around that subject matter.
Did you say device of the self? I'm sorry, my
Yeah, I did.
my ear.
So,
Yeah. Well, all of the work engages with how we constitute the self through images, or how that process is mediated through images, and also mediated through our engagement with other people. And I think what I've learned, like say from my collaborations with the neuroscientists, Lucina Udin and Istvan Molnar Sakac, that even on the level of neurons, that our process of constituting ourself is a social act, that we do that in relation to the call and response to others. And, and then we also see that in other, like, philosophy, right? In Levinas's idea of the face-to-face, that, or our ethical obligations to the other. And so I think of, also think of the ethics of the gift, right? And the face as an offering to the other, that it shouldn't be an obligation, because we of course know that that racism and sexism really, that it's something that's often taken and not allowed to be a gift. And so this is why I say I'm not an essentialist about the face, that the work is very much interested in I guess, these acts of reciprocity, that and what I've learned, certain philosophers call supererogatory acts, that is, actions that are over and above what is expected, that nonetheless we need, and what are the conditions that we feel so moved to act that way toward others. These are things that I'm interested in the work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Feel free to prod further.
Yeah, well, actually I can, because I actually also wanted to see, and we are coming out of COVID, but also these ideas of, the advice of isolation as well, and furthering care. I wonder if you're going to expand on that subject in your work in different forms beyond the PPE Portrait Project. I know that Ashes and Blues was a part of that, and I just want to see if you had any future plans in that same.
I have future plans both for the PPE Portrait Project and also work that I was doing when I got interrupted by the pandemic that I'd like to continue, and other things. In terms of the PPE Portrait Project, I'm in the process of both evaluating it in publishing in medical journals and things like that, to try to establish it as best medical practice for, especially for vulnerable people, say immunocompromised patients, people who primarily only see people behind masks, for whom that's particularly damaging, or people in ICUs who are at risk of getting post-ICU syndrome. So I'd like to, if it warrants, only if it warrants, not for me,
Right.
but if it's useful, it would, I think, be good to make it best practice. I'm also interested to, I really want to try to touch base with more patients that experience them. I really want to hear their words. I always learn so much by the language that people use when to describe their experience.
Right.
Mhm.
Like one of the, like for example, physician narratives, physicians who got Ebola and recovered and wrote about it, their stories were crucial to the development of the project. Like Dr. Senga Omianga, a Liberian doctor, and the Nigerian doctor Adora Okoli. Their articles were just mind-blowing and animated that project. And so I'd like to return to patient narratives and to learn as much as I can from those. And then I was also working on that body of work with Amy Lyford about the death of her husband and the life cast that I took of him before he was cremated. And of course, I'm always interested in indexes. That's why, like photos and casts are in that same wonderful set, type of signs, if you will. And well, I don't want to, I know we're just about at time, but I'd like to wrap up, glean as much as I can. I'm also interested in possibly doing some movement-based work with what I glean from patients. Because there was such, almost a kind of choreography to the donning and doffing process and other physical like kind of performances of the healthcare workers that I've always wanted to explore translating it into movement, and I haven't done that before, and so that's something that I'd like to explore.
Right. I
That
can see
Really-
graphically as well.
Bailey, I think Mary Beth would like Zabia Kolovas's question.
Sure. Do you want to?
Oh, hi, Sophia.
So Zabia said, hi, Mary Beth, what a powerful presentation. I'm curious what your experience has been shifting from such private, personal, studio-based practice to such large-scale global work that feels physical and on a political level, physical on a political level, and feels somewhat necessity driven. Did the art making feel different?
That's such a great question. Thank
It's
you.
a great question.
Yeah.
I didn't want to, we can go over a little bit. So
Yeah.
please feel free.
But you know, at the heart of this project is always the one-to-one. It might be, you know, it's practiced all over the globe now, but that's not where the art is. The art is always what happens between the patient and the healthcare worker. It's not us looking at these pictures. And so it's incredibly intimate. And you know, and the wild thing is that I can barely even get to it. Like, I'm not there. I only hear about it secondhand, you know, because I'm not a healthcare worker. And so I circulate around it, you know, and so that I think that's why I hang on the language so much, because that's how I know it. So it's really intimate. And it's me thinking about, like, if I can just tell, maybe I can wrap up with one story. There was that picture of UMass. I actually have a short video of that, of Mary Carla, who's a music therapist, and she's helping a patient who is largely nonverbal, who got COVID and was on a respirator for weeks. And he was in a very serious, precarious health. His health was in a precarious state, but somehow he pulled through, but he couldn't become independent, breathe independently. And so they brought in a music therapist because they knew he liked to clap and that he liked to drum. And she wore a PPE portrait when she did it. And it somehow, his ability to engage with the music and also look at the picture pulled him out. It was like a lifeline. I'm getting sort of choked up. His caregivers, his chosen family, told us that they thought that it saved his life. And it was probably the music. You know, music is so powerful. But somehow, I can't believe, but somehow they believe that it was the thing that he could grasp onto that invited him back.
That's amazing. You know,
sorry.
no, it's so real. And you know what, I think since we're coming to the end, it made me think when you were just saying that of something you said earlier when you were presenting those early photos of when people were taking pictures of the amputees and things, and they were trying to offer humanity that you could grasp. That's what you said in the earlier part of your presentation, humanity that you could grasp. And these projects that you've worked on, the cyanotypes, the cremains one, are in their own way this attempt to grasp the humanity that's so ephemeral, right? But this project, the PPE project, the story that you just told, the repeated examples of this project having a profound impact on the world show people have allowed people to grasp humanity that was out of their grasp. And I think it's just so important, the project and your work in general, I just think is so important to everything. But this project in particular, for me, as I mentioned to you the other day, every time I think about it, I kind of well up, because I think it's like such a significant world event that you did this. Your talk today was again really moving to me, and I know Bailey too. And I want to thank you for coming and talking to us as we wrap up here. And it's meant a great deal.
Thank you for hosting me, Bailey, Michael. Your questions and the way you frame things has been so interesting and productive. And I want to thank all of the PAC members and all the audience who've made the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. I really appreciate it, and invite you to reach out and get in touch with me any way that you'd like, Heffernan@oxy.edu.
Of course, through us.
And through PAC, don't hold back.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation and your words and thoughts today, Mary Beth. It was such a privilege to have you with us. And thank you everyone for your input and your questions. I think we're going to close out today.
All right. Thank you, Bailey. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, PAC.
All right.
Bye, Mary Beth. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for being here today.
Virtually.